impossible, see the invisible. Row, row, fight the power, touch the untouchable, break the unbreakable. Row, row, fight the power, power to the peeps, power for the dreams.
Hello again. So this video is going to be a little less structured than the last big one because we're going to be talking about 4chan, and naturally I want this video to be as confusing and loosely structured and back and forth as the site itself. That does mean that I'm going to be covering a few sensitive topics, so if anything that you would associate with 4chan is potentially triggering to you, then be forewarned. Forewarned is forearmed, as they say. It's going to be a retroactive and therefore perhaps a bit of a sanitized look at the site, covering some history, site culture, internet culture, some meme history, and a bunch of other things. But this has been written in a pretty stream of consciousness manner, so don't be surprised if there's a distinct rambling nature to this video. It also means that I'm not going to be in it very much, because this is quite long and it's quite warm, and I don't have the energy to sit in front of a camera. Plus at this point I've actually already recorded the whole thing. So that just means you'll have to enjoy a bunch of graphics, screenshots, and a whole bunch of memes. Big bunch of memes. And yeah, this thing is going to be over an hour long, so sorry about that. There's probably not going to be very many breaks in that hour, because it's got no structure. It's a fucking mess. I'm sorry in advance. I'm sorry. Nothing I can do. Not like I made it. Yeah. This is a video for two predominant demographics. Those who are familiar with 4chan but don't really know anything about it, other than that's where the Nazis are now. And those who browse or used to browse 4chan and are looking for some critical analysis of the site, some critiques of site behavior, and maybe just even a nostalgia trip. But anyway, let us begin. We shall embark together on our journey into the asshole of the internet. Let's go.
So this year, I'm not sure when exactly, but sometime July, August, which we're almost at we're right in the middle of August now, will mark 11 years since I first started actively browsing the website formerly known as 4chan.org. I say formerly because now technically it's two domains, with all the safer work boards being hosted on 4channel for revenue purposes. I won't say it's when I first visited the site, because I think my teenage curiosity took me there a couple of times before, though I can't remember clearly enough. This is all over a decade ago, after all. And with that being said, I would like if you could take the information and opinions of this video with a grain of salt, because I'm trying to piece together a lot of very faded memories here. And while there's a lot of resources to cover some of these topics, others I'm just relying on what like 15 to 20-year-old me saw firsthand, and most of that isn't very clear in my head anymore. Now, 4chan isn't quite as controversial as it used to be, or at least it's maintained a pretty steady level of controversy now for the same reasons over a period of some years. Those reasons being its association to the rise of the alt-right and incel subcultures, as well as a handful of murders by people who were either known to use the site or outright admitted on the site to the crime. Obviously that's quite controversial, and I mean no disrespect to the seriousness of all these events and phenomena, but the site used to have a very different, though you could argue equally bad, reputation. The year was 2009. Talking about Boxy was already banned at this point, but I didn't know who she was yet, and 15-year-old me once again found himself looking at the rules of the internet. For most people out there, you may never have seen or been interested to find the full list of rules created long ago for this glorious realm we now inhabit called the internet, though a large number of you, at least if you're already here, will have heard of Rule 34. Rule 34 is, if it exists, there is porn of it, no exceptions. In internet speak, sexual art of a fictional or sometimes real-life person, or sometimes not a person, is often simply referred to as Rule 34 of whatever character or entities it contains. The most important thing about Rule 34 for the moment, though, is that it implies the existence of at least another 33 rules. There are, though it has changed several times and has seen many expanded versions, what appears to be 47 sort of official rules of the internet.
Rule 1, do not talk about B. Rule 2, do not talk about B. Rule 3, we are anonymous. 4, anonymous is legion. 5, anonymous never forgives. 6, anonymous can be a horrible, senseless, uncaring monster. 7, anonymous is still able to deliver. 8, there are no real rules about posting. 9, there are no real rules about moderation either. Enjoy your back. 10, if you enjoy any rival sites. 11, don't. All your carefully picked arguments can be easily ignored. 12, anything you say can and will be used against you. Anything you say can be turned into something else. 14, do not argue with trolls. It means that they win. The harder you try, the harder you will fail. 16, if you fail in epic proportions, it may just become a winning. 17, every win fails eventually. Everything that can be labeled can be hated. The more you hate it, the stronger it gets. 20, nothing is to be taken seriously. 21, original content is original only for a few seconds before getting. 22, copy pasta is made to ruin every last bit of originality. 23, copy pasta is made to ruin every last bit of originality. 24, every repost is always a repost. 25, of a repost. Relation to the original topic decreases with every single post. Any topic can be easily turned into something totally unrelated. Always question a person's sexual preferences without any real reason. 28, always question a person's gender, just in case it's really a man. 29, in the internet, all girls are men, and all kids are undercover FBI agents. There are no girls on the internet. 31, tits or GTFO. 32, you must have pictures to prove your statement. 33, lurk more, it's never enough. 34, there is porn of it, no exception. 35, if no porn is found at the moment, it will be made. 36, there will always be even more fucked up shit than what you cannot divide by 0. Just because the calculator says so. No real limits of any kind apply here. Not even the sky. Caps lock is cruise control for cool! 40, even with cruise control you still have 41, to steer! 42 isn't funny. Seriously guys, it's worse than Chuck Norris. 42, nothing 43, is sacred. The more beautiful and pure a thing is, the more satisfying it is to corrupt it. Even one positive comment about Japanese things can make you a weird. 45, when one sees a lion, one must get into the car. There is always fairy porn of it. 47, the pool is always closed.
I feel being one of the earlier internet memes constructed by 4chan sometime in 2006, finding this image circulating on the internet almost guaranteed that the viewer was curious enough to ask, what is B? And boy, do you not know what you're in for the first time you find yourself on B. I think I was probably 14 or so when I first ended up on B for this reason, and I just found it kind of gross, and I didn't get it, and I left. Yet that summer, shortly after my 15th birthday, I started finding myself on the site more and more, as if some morbid curiosity had awoken itself in me. I will find out what B is. I must have told my little self. And 4chan is a difficult website to browse when you first start, because unless you've used a similar image board before, you have no idea what you're doing. You try making your first thread, and you don't know how to no-code yet, so of course you never even find the fucking thing because B moves so damn fast. No-code. See, the first thing with 4chan is that it was a bit old school. No-code was sort of a command that you had to put in the field of your post to make sure the page automatically went back to your thread after you posted it. Just like in order to post in someone else's thread without bumping it, usually because you think they suck or the thread sucks, you would use Sage.
Though as with most things 4chan managed to get its hands on, this was a perversion of the original intended use of the term.
This is part of the language of 4chan. The language of 4chan is akin to no other. It is a combination of memes, site history, internet culture, random invented words, words appropriated from other places which gain popularity on 4chan, some of which to this day have permeated through internet culture and are colloquially used by people who've probably never been on 4chan in their entire lives. The best example of this would probably be the word weeb. Weeb shares some crossover with the word otaku, which white nerds have been self-identifying with since our
It's like one of my Japanese animes.
But for anyone who doesn't know, weeb is short for weeaboo. In 2003, 4chan had a significant problem with the word Wapanese, a portmanteau of wannabe and Japanese, used to describe white dudes who were obsessed with Japan or Japanese culture and media, so their word filtered it to weeaboo. Users got so used to seeing weeaboo pop up instead that they did what any community of stubborn nerds would do. They just started using the filter word themselves, eventually shortening it to the weeb we know today. And weeb's used across the whole world in nerd circles for this very purpose to this very day. I have many friends who've never been on 4chan who could tell you what a weeb is if you asked. It's become universal internet nomenclature. And that's something that continues to surprise me to this day. And maybe if I'd never found myself on 4chan, I'd be oblivious to it. But 4chan's impact on internet culture hangs like a shadow over everything. I recognize little snippets of 4chan in the way people communicate online, in the way they share and engage with content, in the amount of dudes who just won't shut the fuck up about things they know absolutely nothing about. It's funny because current Facebook political discussions are reminiscent of the style of discussion 4chan once brought to my life. In fact, in beginning to write this, I realized that I didn't stop browsing 4chan by accident, but interesting discussions were now happening on a much more diverse platform, so I started spending more time on Facebook and less time on 4chan. I even still use meme arrows to structure story-based or hyperbolic posts when I'm off 4chan, because, to be honest, it's a great way to boil down a story to its essence. And I'm sure there are a bunch of man-children out there who'll be upset about me saying that Facebook has better discourse than 4chan, but come on, that's been true for a while now, even if it wasn't always. If you go back far enough, despite the notoriously edgy nature of the site and all of the porn and gore, 4chan used to be a quite left-leaning site, or at least there was some sort of heart in there underneath all the shit. There was no one binding ideology that could sum up all the users, I feel is the major difference. Right now, if you ask someone about 4chan, they'll say incel, or alt-right, or ew, fuck that place. But there was a time when the users, as mentioned in my interim video, fought for justice against animal abusers, took down corporations for fun, could influence major polls, flood into any online space as locusts to devour anyone who'd done the world or them wrong. The community rejected the masculine, or at least internalized their trauma at the hands of society. They understood, or some understood, that in order to get better we had to share, and fuck, you could read stories on 4chan that would snap you out of feeling bad for yourself for just how awful someone else out there had it. 4chan cared about nothing, but sometimes it cared about you, or you could at least pretend that it cared about you. That's the nice thing about Anonymous. I think there's a crucial misunderstanding of exactly what happened to take the site from edgy anarchists and centrist libertarians and general contrarian edgy fuckheads to being a complete pillar of the right wing online. The first mistake people make is the assumption that because 4chan has always hosted problematic content, that it has always been populated by the right wing. And that's quite simply not true. It was just populated by mostly white men, so naturally there was a higher tolerance for problematic jokes because they weren't the butt of most of them. And, well, it was a decade ago. People weren't woke like they are now. And there's a difference between jokes and ideology. And until the 2011 to 2014 period, there was no pervasive problematic ideology that you could say the whole site shared. But while 4chan users have always had issues with women, and users were on the whole somewhat misogynistic, it wasn't until that period, sort of leading up to Gamergate in 2014 that the site took a radical shift towards the incel view of the world. In fact, I'd say that I run into more racist and right-wing content on Facebook in present day than I did when I first started browsing 4chan in 2009, by a considerable margin. Though on Facebook there's probably slightly less anti-Semitism and about equal amounts of misogyny. I don't know if that will come as a shock to some people, but maybe that's more of a condemnation of Facebook's moderation than it is a praise for 4chan. If I had to represent them as graphs, it would look a little something like this, just on a severity scale out of 10. And neither's the, if we had 4chan 2016 on that list, then, it would be all of it combined. But, yeah, Facebook's real shithole these days, in some places. To say a lot of the hatred hadn't always been there under the surface would be disingenuous, but where someone had been abused or humiliated or rejected by someone that they tried to pursue in their life, the common theme was, forget them, we're your family now, or stop feeling sorry for yourself, you loser. Not, women should be our sex slaves. Though it was still there on occasion, people used to make fun of the radicals, just like they made fun of anyone who actively tried to preach racism more than anything as a joke. It would have still been an uncomfortable sight to browse for anyone who wasn't a white male nerd, but it wasn't what it is now, is all I'm saying. And I think I get why millennials on the right who cry free speech so much have such an over-attachment to this edgy shock humor, despite it being some of the most predictable and dated humor still in use. Like, the 2000s, if I had two words to describe the theme of the 2000s, it would be edge and lolso random. Edgy humor was rife, and even offline there was no shortage of stand-ups who were trying to make their mark on the industry by being deliberately edgy, saying things on stage that they knew they shouldn't say or they knew would be inflammatory. And I'll admit, there's a certain joy in watching a crowd react to deliberate bait. Even now, it's great watching someone reply unironically to something you know is a copy-pasta or getting angry over an Onion article. But it really depends on the context, because one can be deliberately inflammatory without attacking the humanity of another group within society. And in my opinion, one should be, unless there's adequate context to justify it. For instance, I could say that I enjoy pineapple on a pizza, or I think that your favourite movie is overrated, or that our current capitalist system is inherently unsustainable and predicated on mass suffering of humans and animals across the globe. And depending on who you are, one of those statements might compel you to leave an angry response. But none of those statements really attack anyone on a personal or human level unless you're Italian. So there's an art to it. There's not really an art to, shitposting Nazi propaganda in a Jimmy Neutron Facebook group. Anybody can do that. But I get it. It was also the time of awful consumerism, terrible pop music, pop punk, nu metal, the whole emo goth scene culture, Eminem's early stuff.
As well as things like South Park and Family Guy, which really didn't help.
A real mess of edginess and marketable aesthetic. Now, inject that into internet culture with a bunch of sad and broken teens and 20-somethings who desperately need to rebel against something. A fucking catastrophe. Honestly, for anyone who needs a real-world example of what this would look like, just Google Woodstock 99. Suppose it didn't help that almost everywhere on the internet was taken over by men. Or boys, rather. Rule 30. There are no girls on the internet. Glad we could circle back to that. This doesn't mean what it looks like it means. This means that, as there was ultimately no way in the early days to discern a person's gender, that all those claiming to be women should be treated as men until proven otherwise, and if unstated, should be treated as men by default. If there weren't so much misogynistic context for why this rule exists, it would almost be making an argument for treating people equally regardless of their gender. I can't think of a site I used that wasn't edgy in some way during my earliest years on the internet. Everyone had something to prove, and you can be anyone online. How convenient. Even in the early days, I remember there were a lot of wannabe badasses, though I'm not sure the term keyboard warrior had yet been coined. But this edgy boys club of the internet was swayed from the opinion of, I suffered and the world is bad, so let's try and change it so the next generation suffers less, to the very boomer mentality of, I suffered and the world is bad, so everyone else should suffer and nobody can claim it they had it worse than me. And they're usually so hyper-focused on the ways that their own lives have been difficult that they find it impossible to believe that other people face struggles that they couldn't possibly understand. And so now any form of shock humor, even if it's a repost of a repost of a repost of a repost, even if literally nobody finds it funny, even if it's openly peddling racist pseudoscience, mocking the deaths of the vulnerable, it needs to be protected violently. Because if we stop allowing people to openly attack others in public spaces, the Nazis win. Or something. I don't know. This isn't my argument.
The second mistake people make is assuming that those who became radicalized did so because they already had some underlying hatred of women or minorities before reaching the site, and that they must be unintelligent to have bought such propaganda. But the real issue with 4chan is... The real issue with 4chan is that it was full of incredibly academically gifted and socially perceptive people, but people who had such narrow life experience, such little political education, and political education across the world is severely lacking, and who'd faced such terrible abuse that they were incredibly easy to manipulate. And to this day I still see the same arguments from MRAs against feminism that popped up with greater and greater frequency during the early 2010s, as well as the same arguments that racists used to present day. Now, 4chan tried to contain this. Good old Moot tried several times to make sure the site wasn't filled with right-wing losers spouting off about women and black people and the Jews. So the story goes, the Nazis on 4chan were mostly originating from Stormfront.org, a website an old KKK leader founded in the 90s, or at least there was a lot of crossover. Wikipedia states that Stormfront had over 120,000 active members in 2009, which is a lot, but there aren't many places you can actively promote those views or advertise a site like that, which is, I guess, why they began to cross over more and more with 4chan. Before Poll existed, people would often tell 4chan as being too overtly racist and anti-Semitic to go back to Stormfront. So, jumping back a little, in 2008, Moot had deleted the then news board, N, because people were beginning to use it overwhelmingly to post racial crime statistics, likely both in an effort to be edgy and because the board seemed to have attracted a literal crowd of unironic active racists. That's the big difference. Whilst you could find any level of hatred on any board of 4chan, though more commonly on a handful, which will be mentioned throughout, being racist on 4chan, for the majority of these people, was only a performance of edginess, a place where a white guy could freely say the N-word and laugh about it. It was horrible, but not with any purpose. Once they started grouping up, it became far more of a problem. Eventually, due to overspill in other boards, Moot revived the board as new in January 2010. This was something 4chan did with all of its invasive communities throughout its history, created a containment board. The next board to be created for a community which began taking up a lot of space on the video games board, for instance, was the Pokemon community. Very shortly after this, in July of 2010. A far less sinister and repugnant community, but invasive nonetheless. After that, it was probably the Bronies in 2011, until MLP got created in 2012. That one was somewhere in the middle, because nobody should have to see their community flooded with pony porn on a daily basis. Like, if that's what you're into, yeah, keep it on DeviantArt, for fuck's sake. This invasion of proto-Nazis on new, though the board was once again deleted in January 2011, somewhere in the middle of the Brony fiasco, maybe explains why there's some Nazi-Brony crossover now that I think about it. At that point, it wasn't really a news board anymore, so I think Moot just thought, fuck it, and rebranded it so it was easily identifiable as a Nazi quarantine zone. So in November 2011, it was revived as the poll we know and hate today. Any attempt to drive a community out of 4chan never really worked, or if they left, as some people did, briefly when N was closed in 2008 and New was closed in 2011, they created their own copycat hubs of propaganda and came raiding random 4chan boards and threads with it. The administration of 4chan never had the resources to moderate to the point where it could be curbed, not only because the site was always operating on a shoestring budget or operating at a loss sometimes, but because of the nature of the anonymous posting, with the user base of people who either know how to avoid bans or can learn easily enough, and with millions of concurrent users every month, you're fighting an uphill battle, a really fucking steep one. Just a quick aside here, I want to point out that not all posting on 4chan is anonymous. Anonymity is voluntary, but sort of enforced by community rule. There is a name field at the top of the post box on 4chan which can be filled out to have a name appear with your post. Or if you're really obnoxious and want everyone to hate you immediately, you can have a trip code, which is a code generated after your name which allows people to maintain a permanent identity within a board. I don't recall a lot of trips, but two of the most reviled on the video games board when I was browsing were Manly Tears and Lance Jack. Lance Jack used to post using pictures of Kanata Izumi from Lucky Star alongside every single post, and Manly Tears, he has an entire Encyclopedia Dramatica article about him if you want to do some light reading. Similarly, in 2008, the R9K board, Robot 9000, was created, and though this was originally an experiment with the Comic XKCD to try and force users to make original posts, the board slowly sank into becoming a self-quarantine for a large group of the incels on 4chan. And I suppose users, in their arrogance, never saw just how big these problems were going to get at the time. The R9K itself was also deleted eventually once the experiment ended, then it was revived without its prior requirement for post originality shortly afterwards. R9K is responsible largely for the Virgin versus Chad memes you may be familiar with, as well as overusing the word normies to the point where anyone who has ever successfully engaged in a social activity with another person is basically considered a normie. Originally, normie was a sort of synonym for browsers who appeared neurotypical or did not conform to the cultural norms of the site, which I suppose from the beginning meant anyone who'd gotten laid was technically a normie, regardless of how otherwise inept they were.
Victory Screech!
With that, I want to address another issue, which is that whilst the 4chan community is quite obviously academically gifted, in some part, I'm saying this as someone on the autistic spectrum who spent years on 4chan, it seems to be somewhat related to the fact that many 4chan users ended up on 4chan because they were bullied for autistic traits, which can often include both above average academic performance at young ages and inability to pass social situations as well as those around them. Essentially, they were the creepy nerd before they had a chance to be anything else, and this is a problem in society. Awareness for exactly what autism can look like is kind of lacking. The fact that many people still openly support Autism Speaks, despite them being a eugenicist hate group, really shows how little people actually look into the places they think are helping. The problem is that most of these kids probably don't look visibly autistic, whatever that means. I think I was about 13 when I first realized that I was probably on the spectrum, and at the time I really didn't have any idea what it meant. But I kept that to myself because I didn't know what to do with it either. I wasn't sure. I related to everything I heard about autism, but I just wasn't sure if I was autistic enough, you know? I didn't know how to tell people I thought I was autistic. I didn't want to get laughed at. I was already laughed at enough. I didn't want people to think I thought I was broken or that they were doing something wrong. So for years, I just buried that realization. And to be honest, despite everything that happened in between, there are only a handful of people in my life I've outright told that I believe I'm on the spectrum, and I'm currently trying to pursue an official diagnosis here in Germany for the first time in my life. Now, of course, in 2009, I found 4chan. The first thing you notice about 4chan is that they're very open and self-aware about the fact that the majority of them have some sort of social dysfunction, whether it be that they are on the autism spectrum or something else. To the point that a significant portion of 4chan's humor is self-deprecating and full of internalized ableism regarding the whole community, somewhat playfully, as a bunch of autists. And fuck it, I kind of identify with that word for having spent so much time on the site around these people, and whilst I would never use it to refer to someone else who has autism, I'm fucking reclaiming autist for myself. The ableist can come fucking fight me. Being able to be around this open pride almost in being able to freely express oneself as autistic is something I think a lot of the community probably felt kinship with, in a similar way to how eccentric expression of one's sexuality is used by the queer community as a form of protest. These teenage boys who'd been told their whole lives that they were weird and creepy and who were constantly made fun of, gaslit, left out of things, sometimes faced physical violence, homophobic abuse, or being treated as if they were the opposite gender because of their inability to conform to traditional standards of masculinity, they were taking autism and making it their own. They did a piss poor job of it in the long run, and I'll be going into that later, but earlier on, this group of traumatized autistic femboys who wanted to fight for social justice, who wanted to make sure that the bullies of the world were held accountable, that realized how the men around them treated women and sought to create effectively what was sort of an anonymous meritocracy which in its own way is problematic because it would have been meritocratic from the point of view of teenage white nerds, which means you just have to have read the most books by 19th century dead white men to be at the top. And when I was a kid, it didn't matter how much people made fun of me, or how many social situations I fucked up, or how many jokes went over my head, or whether people didn't like me. I didn't start getting bitter about it until I was a teenager. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I think when I was younger, I had less of a filter, and I just assumed people were generally good, even despite everything I could observe. But puberty is a wild ride for everyone. And as the bullying intensified in the first couple of years of high school, leaving me suicidal at several points, though I didn't have anyone I was close enough to tell, I began resenting the people around me for how differently I was treated. I began to think that I was better than them because I didn't bully anyone. I think that's where a lot of the rationale behind being a nice guy comes from, because you've endured a decade of escalating torment whilst everyone around you seems to have been given some sort of instruction book on how to be a social person. And because you believed people were good, you've let people take advantage of you over and over to the point where there's very little left. You have no intimate friends because you don't like putting your troubles on others, or because you simply don't have a friend you can trust enough, or you're so bad at communicating you can't even voice your worries to another human being. And I've fallen into all three of those categories at different points in my life.
And just before continuing, I'd like to read something that kind of has nothing to do with 4chan before I jump back into the 4chan stuff. I think it very succinctly explains what a lot of this experience is about. Sometimes people don't understand that we are hated for being autistic. But I don't hate autistic people. That's right, because you don't know how autistic people are. You know, people never bullied me for being autistic, because neither me nor they had the terminology. Nah, they punished me for being weird. And what made me weird to their eyes? I spoke weird and often stumbled. And I spoke like a grown-up anyway. And I wouldn't shut up about ancient Greece. I moved weird too, because I am really clumsy. And I didn't have any friends. I was boring and didn't catch jokes, made at my expense. And I didn't look them in the eye. And so on, and so on. If you asked any of the people who bullied me for years whether they hate autistic people, they'd say no. Because they don't hate autistic people. But oh boy do they hate weird people. Perhaps they don't hate autistic people, but surely they hated me for being obviously autistic.
One thing I recall about Old B was bore/feels threads, in which people would do nothing but share their darkest, saddest moments in green text form, and comfort other posters who had experienced awful situations, ranging from disagreements with parents, to being made homeless, to deaths of loved ones. And I know it's odd thinking of B as a place where people could be open and vulnerable and legitimately care for one another and offer advice, but that was a part of the culture. There was good with the bad, just like there were assholes who would crash those threads to tell people to stop being sad and ruining 4chan with emotional shit, on occasion flooding the thread with unpleasant images to interrupt discussion. Probably the same kind of people who had to come up with the term manly tears to express their emotions online whilst shielding their fragile masculinity. And what's curious about this is that it perfectly highlights that this community very well understands what toxic and wholesome masculinity are, and did even all the way back then. These people could recognize that the violence and the taunting and the name-calling were all toxic forms of asserting dominance over a weaker person. And there was a lot of hatred on 4chan for what would go on to be the Chad archetype, and rightly so, because the site embraced the sort of rejection of the toxically masculine, in some ways, and completely blundered in others, such as then going on to blame women for not picking them instead of working to support future autistic children or raise awareness in some way so this same abuse isn't inflicted on another generation of kids. We do not support entitlement to women's bodies on this channel. Stay mad, incels. I'm sure Lobster Daddy will arrive with your state-mandated GF any day now. So slowly we went from socially conscious nerds who indulge in deliberately edgy humor and behavior to harshly jaded misanthropic nerds who indulge in attacking vulnerable minority communities or defending those who do vehemently. Another thing that would probably benefit this cause is better relationship, social, and sexual education, but you never see these kind of guys pushing for that either. It's only the feminists and the lefties pushing for the things that would actually help discrimination and social segregation within the school environment. I might do a separate video on how almost every single MRA issue that they say feminists don't care about is actually something that feminists have been discussing or fighting longer than any MRA group has ever existed, but I don't have the time to go into that now. This is already far too long. Now, on the topic of demographics, I think another large factor in why 4chan had such a homogeneous identity is that there seemed to be a fair amount of suburban and rural users. I'm not sure how true that is, but I recall very few stories where people would mention they lived in a large metropolitan area. But maybe it also makes sense that people stuck in the middle of white suburbia or the countryside are less likely to have support during their shitty childhoods, especially if they're queer or neurodivergent, but I don't know for sure. My hometown, for instance, has 35,000 people and is about as white as taking an ethnic dish and turning it into a flavoured potato chip, which means I didn't really have to think about the concept of whiteness growing up, and whilst a lot of my childhood friends were queer, I had no real attachment to queer culture, or even knowledge of it past gay pride being a thing that was mentioned in the news sometimes. I was in the closet myself until I was about 16, though again that was something 4chan allowed me to explore and discuss in open and sometimes constructive platform. And yes, 4chan and queer culture is something I'll discuss a little later, but in short it's probably how we ended up with Natsu trans catgirls. Now you take this group of overachieving and abused teen boys who already have a superiority complex because, well, if you spent your whole life academically outperforming most of your peers whilst also facing endless abuse from those same peers because you're seen as different in some way, put all of them on the same website, give them anonymity and zero accountability, of course they're going to form a community around their intellectual superiority. Unfortunately, being academically gifted or even having a greater ability to perceive useless social hierarchies does not make a person automatically correct in all areas, and often contributes to blind spots with regards to issues they don't have personal experience with. This is why, despite using such flawed logic and relying on biased or misleading information, so few of those people who fell into the depths of the more toxic side of this community are able to accept that they might be wrong about something. When you've spent your whole life being smarter than everyone around you and centering your entire personality on your intellectual superiority, it can be kinda hard to accept that other people out there might have better ideas or understanding of issues than you do, especially if you've been propagandized from your mid-teen years when the mind is extremely vulnerable to ideology. And when you've never done anything your whole life to harm a single person, and have in return been a victim of much harm, it's easy to believe that you are a good or nice person, long after you've stopped being either good or nice. That's not to say that every asshole on the internet who thinks they're a nice guy genuinely was a nice guy at some point, but there are definitely a number of people out there who probably spent the first 14 to 18 years of their life legitimately trying to make connections with people and trying to be a good person, only to be met with constant rejection, isolation, and mistreatment. If there's one thing that the nice guy incel mindset can be sort of boiled down to, it's an inability to view the world in a lens beyond the environment in which they receive their compulsory education, reducing all of the world beyond school to stereotypes that don't exist out in the real world, or if they do, it's to a much lesser extent. Now, I was never under the impression that I was significantly smarter than the people around me, though during this period of my own life I did have a massive superiority complex akin to what I've been describing here. I just thought I was a little smarter. Not enough to make any difference out in the world. I didn't buy into the jocks and cool kids are unintelligent and won't go anywhere in life thing, because in England it's not really like that, and I'm sure that in the US it's probably not like that to the extent that the media likes to portray. But I've seen nerds really internalize the "don't worry, people will love you when you grow up and get a good job with your smarts" narrative. And it's incredibly damaging, because it brings nothing but either self-pity or self-aggrandizement. The only US media I've seen that I can remember handling this well is Booksmart, the scene where Molly very confidently asks the cool kids where they're going to college, only to find out they've all gotten into Ivy League places or equivalent. I can't remember the exact institutions that were mentioned, and is horrified that people she looks down on are actually just intelligent as she is, and have done the work necessary to move forward as her academic equal. This, in my opinion, is much closer to the reality of the situation. In my case, almost half of the people in the top classes with me were pretty popular. A lot of the guys were in sports teams, but there was no dumb jock, smart nerd dichotomy. It didn't exist. So at least I escaped that delusion for the most part. Here I sit now, university dropout and professional internet nerd trying to educate people about the history of 4chan. I made it. Joking aside, that's not the only problematic way media plays into the mindset of the troubled and misunderstood white nerd dude. There's no shortage of intellectual asshole characters that these kinds of people identify with. And of course, they're justified in their assholeness because of their intelligence or their past trauma, or both. I'm not saying they're not compelling characters, or that the characters themselves are bad people, though sometimes they are, but they lend credence to the self-important and righteous persona that these boys craft for themselves, using exactly the same justifications, despite never having achieved the things that these fictional men have achieved. I think it also somewhat connects to the hatred people have for any protagonist who does not reflect their own demographic, because if the lead character isn't a smart white asshole man, then is it really worth engaging with that piece of media at all? Honestly, I wish not engaging was the extent of their responses. Instead, they have to deride it for being political, especially looking at you gamers. Now, most people in this demographic aren't the hyper-ignorant conservative types that will shout at Tom Morello or Serge Tankian for getting political on social media, but they're still somewhat unable to pass subtext, and will frequently complain about people injecting politics into things, despite that media always having been political. And yes, the Wolfenstein ones are usually people's go-to here, because you can't really get more off-base than complaining about politics in a game series that's centered around killing Nazis, but often it's more subtle. And when you're unable to identify and understand subtext within the media you're consuming, you leave yourself open to completely misunderstanding and misinterpreting the underlying messages. And going back to high school, I blame the English curriculum for this. If people were taught about actual subtext in politics in high school instead of things like blue means sad and rain means negative emotions, then maybe we wouldn't have people who miss these points so bad. But I guess it's in the interest of the establishment to make sure people aren't looking for the actual deeper meanings in things and unable to understand art. I don't know if that's intentional in how the curriculum is written, or if it's just coincidence, because education is in massive need of reform and modernization. But either way, it's not good for anyone. Especially considering 4chan is obsessed with media. If you go to any one of the media-specific boards like A or TV, V, Lit, Mu, you'll find that it's full of incredibly elitist people who all believe that their tastes are better than everyone else's. And sure, not everyone on 4chan is like that, but there's enough of them that it's immediately obvious. And to give credit where it's due, people on 4chan generally have been exposed to more high art than the average person. But that doesn't mean much if you either don't understand it or you're such a shitty person that nobody wants to discuss it with you. And this again stems from the rejections of norms of the media and the never-ending search to find the highest possible art. And whilst channers will appreciate popular culture on occasion, when they deem it artistically worthy enough to be consumed, mainstream culture is largely shunned in favour of the weird, obscure, and complex. 4chan also popularised the use of patrician and pleb in reference to art, a trend which has made its way into a number of art appreciation communities, often derivative of 4chan culture, and whilst slightly more diverse in their makeup, are predominantly comprised of just a slightly more woke version of the white nerd you'd find on 4chan. The content in these places is usually somewhat problematic from time to time, but they tend not to be outright white supremacists. Obviously, in their young naivete, a lot of people believe that this will make them more interesting and appear more intellectual, because they consume only the highest of art, selected by the most intelligent curators that exist, 4chan browsers. In reality, their elitism, coupled with the obscure nature of the media they consume, only serves to further isolate them from a society in which they already feel out of place. When asked what your favourite movie is, you're probably not going to get far in a conversation if you're just like,
I'm sorry, I only watch real cinema, like Bergman, Fellini, Tar, Kurosawa. The list goes on.
Unless you're hanging out with a crowd of intense film enthusiasts. For anyone who needs to hear this, if you're intentionally avoiding mainstream media and consuming the most inaccessible art possible, don't be surprised when the average person around you finds you yourself inaccessible. Now, I'm not saying that having niche interests or exploring the depths the art world has to offer is a bad thing, But coupled with the elitism that usually hangs over people who pride themselves in having consumed better media than others, it generally makes you seem like a pretentious asshole. But on 4chan, sometimes you can command respect by just having consumed enough. Unfortunately, during the 2010s, obscure hipster stuff started getting a really bad rap, even out in the real world, which meant I couldn't talk about the things I liked without the insecurity of, is this person going to think I'm pretentious for liking things they've never heard of? And that really killed my confidence in being able to openly talk about my interests, because you would immediately get labeled as some kind of poser for rejecting mainstream culture. And that in itself has a kind of anti-intellectualism undercurrent in my mind. The idea that people who look for things with a deeper meaning or look for things outside of the mainstream are trying too hard or trying to look better than others. It's absolutely valid to want to consume both mainstream or non-mainstream media. The idea that anyone who consumes non-mainstream media is pretentious is basically the same as saying no one should consume anything but mainstream media. What's strangest of all is that the same people who define themselves by their academic ability and who are unable to pass subtext in art spend so much time trying to consume the best art, despite the fact that by admission of their own behavior they aren't going to get much out of it beyond the surface level. And honestly, as an autistic person who wasn't politically educated before 2015 or so, I'll admit I was one of these people who would watch super artsy stuff, sometimes just for the sake of it, or because I think it looks cool, without being able to appreciate or understand a lot of the metaphors or symbolism that were appearing before me. And really a lot of it does come down to politics and philosophy and social issues, as they tend to be the dominant subtextual areas that artists work into their art. But until I learnt more about the world and had a greater depth of experience outside of my computer screen, I missed a lot of what was going on in the media I was consuming, unless it was blatantly obvious. And unfortunately, instead of finding diverse spaces in the real world where you can discuss and appreciate these interests with fellow humans, most channers only ever discuss media with other channers, which creates a kind of echo chamber of a lot of people with conflicting ideas, because none of them understand it the same way, despite the deepest wishes that they all have the correct understanding. And because they never meet other people in their real lives who enjoy these things, often due to lack of access and availability of art communities, they funnel this appreciation for the obscure into their superiority complex, believing that they have yet again improved themselves beyond the realm of the normie and transcended into enlightenment. Sadly for them, artsy spaces tend to be somewhat left-wing outside of 4chan, so the chances of the majority of these dudes being able to tolerate the people who do actually enjoy the same art as them is pretty slim to begin with. Not to mention that they probably couldn't have a civil discussion about a piece of media, even if they did.
Henceforth, what is to come I will relate, though therefore give due audience and attend, the second source of men while yet but few, and while the dread... Oh, sorry. I didn't see you there. 'Tis I, the last of the Renaissance men, who is both your academic superior and can enjoy such fine pieces of art as In the Aeroplane Over the Sea and Andrei Rublev. Please, bask in my eternal glory.
Like, fuck off, mate. Literally every artist you appreciate would hate you as a person. Now, I'm not saying that you can't appreciate art by people who hold different views or belong to different groups to yourself, but it seems rather strange to go out of your way to consume such diverse art across several hundred years of history, spanning all cultures and languages, created by all manner of people, while simultaneously holding the belief that people from an out-group have less worth than you. These people are willing to accept artists across every medium, regardless of their demographics, as talented, or even genius, if they enjoy the art they create, but simultaneously refuse to believe the demographics they belong to as a whole are worthy of the same respect. It's effectively media-centric tokenism, selective appreciation of elements of culture, but I suppose we've all seen at least one person pull an equivalent to, I can't be racist, I listen to hip-hop. Everyone is inherently worthless until they make art I enjoy. Ancient white proverb. Now, this wasn't everyone on 4chan. There are definitely a group of very left-wing ex-browsers who are vocal on the internet about their experiences unlearning the damage 4chan has caused, and want to see others take that same path away from the radicalization inherent in the site since the last decade. I'd also wager that browsers of different boards would have different chances of seeing through the pervasive bullshit. Some of the more niche boards, or those with older browsers, would likely be less vulnerable to falling down the right-wing rabbit hole, whereas a shitfest board like B or V would have been far more susceptible, though I can't speak for most of the boards on 4chan as I've only frequented a few of them, plus like a dozen of them are just dedicated to different types of porn and erotic art. Board culture is also an interesting thing, because each board has its own balance between shitposting and constructive discussion, between regular threads, or generals, and ad hoc posting, between discussing anime titties and discussing all topics which are not in fact anime titties. Some elements of board culture would last, and some wouldn't. When I first started browsing the television and film board, the board had a culture of threads for waifu posting. Waifu posting is a huge part of 4chan culture. Another phrase which was popularized on 4chan is best girl, usually referring to female anime characters who the viewer vibes with the most during a particular series. And these carried across from anime culture to be site-wide, first into video games, then transposed onto real women playing real roles in live-action media. But there were an incredibly large number of threads every day dedicated to certain actresses, or just to actresses in general, that people on the board appreciated, as well as much pushback from people who wanted to actually discuss media and not celebrities. And with it being 4chan, there was a fair amount of misogyny on both sides of that fence, of course. These threads were subsequently subjected to heavy moderation, and were usually deleted as long as the mods weren't asleep. Mods are asleep. Post feet pics.
For anyone who was playing along in our bonus round at home, if you guessed those feet belong to Emma Stone and Kristen Stewart respectively, you have won! The prize of being incredibly sad.
With 4chan's libertarian attitude, they generally resisted moderation as fiercely as they could, but eventually the board turned into a space for more creative discussion. Contrary to popular belief, 4chan is not a place where anything goes. You have to conform to the standards of that society as you would in any other social group. Good shitposting is almost always encouraged, though. One of the best memes, in my opinion, of all time was forced into the world around this point also, though to call it a forced meme may be a little harsh, it certainly wasn't not forced. Bane posting. I swear, even after 7 years I can still remember almost every line of dialogue from the open scene of The Dark Knight Rises, and seeing a good Bane meme still makes me chuckle, though it's few and far between now that it's left the meme geist.
Anybody else out there who misses Bane posting, hit me with a for you in the comments.
All boards had their habits, meme culture, and significant events. Sometimes these would be song embeds on the board, or a backup board they like to retreat to in times of trouble, as 4chan was often subject to invades from other sites, either to spam post, to try and troll, or to try and steal gets, though this was mostly an 8chan habit. So the habit of trying to get dubs or trips in a thread is one thing, but a get is when the post number reaches a significant amount of repeating digits, enough that people will be actively waiting for it and trying to get that post number, just for the hell of it. Stealing a get, or the concept of stealing a get, comes from getting enough people together to invade a particular board to try and snipe the post number with a comment that is antithetical to 4chan culture, thereby upsetting people. So stealing a specific post number to troll. And here we have a nice 666-666-66 get for RIP Harambe. Though this has been removed from some boards due to them being flooded with get threads, where people would just post trying to get dubs and trips over and over. It's been disabled on B for years now. B, though, liked to flee to X, the paranormal board, whenever B was broken, or threatened, or invaded. And 4chan was broken sometimes, or boards, or the whole site occasionally, were post-frozen, allowing you only to view, unable to post any new content until the site was unfrozen. Returning to my mention of embeds, some of the ones I remember most vividly are Gallo Sengen, Hoodie Hoodie, Harmony, America Fuck Yeah, and of course, Kongu's Code, which made several appearances across different boards throughout 4chan history. Usually the embedding of a song or theme to a board accompanied a cultural event, either within the site or in the outside world. Gallo Sengen marked the victory of the video games board against Reddit in Tribes Ascend, as well as the formation of the board VG, Video Game Generals, splitting from V. Always by Erasure was embedded upon request of V-citizens after the board discovered Robot Unicorn Attack. America Fuck Yeah was embedded on B the day that Bin Laden was killed. And in one instance, Kamzus Todd was embedded on V when Facebook bought Oculus because gamers saw it as another step in the corporatization of the virtual gaming future. Putty Putty is an exception because it was one of the things purely intended to piss off board members, as well as all posts on B auto-filtering to strings of Putty 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 Putty. Hell, a number of these songs and a bunch of other mimetic pieces of music on the site were covered by groups of channers. Some of them are actually pretty good. Some of them are pretty dreadful. But if you search 4chan Sings on YouTube, you'll get a few dozen results of people from A singing anime themes, from V singing video music, from Mew singing whatever popular tracks were in the core artist group at the time. Then there's Katawa Shoujo, a visual novel created by a group who originated on the anime board of 4chan. Honestly, I don't know whether I'd find it disgusting if I played it in present day, but I remember it being surprisingly wholesome considering its subject matter and where the creators came from. I found an 8-year-old Kotaku article on it, which I'll put in the description box for anyone who wants to know any more about that. There was a certain whimsy to not knowing exactly what would happen next on the site, what the next big meme or joke or piece of inescapable culture would be, or whether something was just flavor of the month and would disappear in a short while. Not everything has the same longevity in the meme world, and whilst there's yet to be a situation in which anyone has really been far even has decided to use even go want to do look more like, some things do just disappear. There are likely countless memes lost to the ages because they weren't culturally significant enough. I did some browsing through the chronology of Know Your Meme before I wrote this script and made a note of all the significant memes I recognized from the early days of 4chan. And trust me, there's a lot. Once you open the door,
Everybody want the dinosaur. Open the door, get on the door. Everybody want the dinosaur. Open the door, get on the door. Everybody want the dinosaur. Open the door, get on the door. Everybody barrel roll, shoot the barrel roll, shoot the barrel roll, shoot the barrel roll.
You're lucky she even performed for you bastards! Leave Benny alone! Please!
Turn on. It's you. How are you, gentlemen? All your days are belong to us.
Gilgamesh!
Its power level. It's over 9,000. Shock your soul.
Let rain. A baby born will die before the sin. Chocolate rain. The schools say it can't be here again. Chocolate rain. The prisons make you wonder.
Though a lot of these would never be recognized outside of those who browse or used to browse 4chan, and often confuse people when they're shared into the rest of the internet, because they're incredibly obtuse or refer to a specific event in internet history, events long before many people sharing memes today were even aware that memes existed. Not to sound like a meme snob or anything, but that's basically my job here. Certified meme connoisseur. It's one of the burdens of being around during the development of early internet culture. You see people sharing memes that you saw years ago, sometimes a decade ago, and you're like, people still think this is funny? Or people have never seen this before? But then I remembered that I didn't know that Pepe the Frog was called Pepe until people started talking about rare Pepes in 2015 leading up to Trump's presidency. And the symbol became, associated with the alt-right. I didn't know what I thought his name was. Maybe I thought he didn't have one, or that he was just 4chan Frog, but I'd never looked into the origins. I'd never seen anyone refer to him by that name during my many years on the site. So I guess we all have our mimetic blind spots.
Going back to the overarching point of the video, I just feel sad for these people who would have possibly come out of this on the same side as me, but were unable to find a community with which they could grow in a healthy direction. And it's weird to see a community go from complaining about masculine men, how they use their confidence and physical strength to take advantage of those around them, to ending up on exactly the other side of the argument a decade later during the Me Too movement. Because they either don't believe men could be that bad, despite having believed it in the past, or they are so defensive of their own masculinity that they need to defend themselves when really they aren't under attack unless they're an abuser themselves. Developing the Stockholm Syndrome in your 20s because you think it's going to be the way to get people to like or respect you, or find you attractive, seems counterintuitive when you've spent so much of your life aware of the fact that it just doesn't work for you, and complaining that people who spend time caring about aesthetics or pursuing physical strength are beneath you, unless you browse fit. And that's not to say there's anything wrong with those pursuits either, just that from the standpoint of a scrawny nerd who has historically only cared about art and academia, it makes little sense to do a full 180 and attempt to become a Chad. Not only that, but say, for example, I give you, just going to pick a random number here, 12 rules to live your life by. Even if they work for you, you're adopting someone else's structure, someone else's idea of what being a man is. You're forcing yourself into a mold because you're tired with your life not going how you want. But observing a set of rules or creating structure in your life doesn't really mean much if someone else has told you, this is how you can fit into society like you always wanted. Just follow my instructions. Because you're no longer being your own person. And clearly the problem was initially, there isn't a safe space for me to be myself in society without facing abuse. The problem was not, I am broken and need to be fundamentally changed to fit society. Because wanting to appear normal is almost the same as wanting to be normal, which in the case of those on the spectrum, or with some sort of social dysfunction, is rooted in internalized ableism. Can't keep your mask on your whole life. Though it goes without saying, if you're now a Nazi, you should fundamentally change yourself to fit society. Nobody is born a Nazi. It can be helped. Obviously, the history of internet politics surrounding gender is incredibly complex, and this is going to be me oversimplifying it a little bit. And nerds do often have just as poor attitude towards women as the men that they hate themselves, though usually it is displayed in very different ways, because they're raised in the same broken society everyone else is. But white liberal identity politics taking the forefront of internet political discourse for several years, thanks largely to Tumblr, meant a lot of people's first exposure to the left was screeching radfems who seemed completely unable to discuss political intersections of race, ability, class, religion, etc., and could only approach politics in terms of gender. I think this probably did more harm than good and drove a lot of young men away from engaging with the left in the future. Proof of this is the fact that people on the right still make man-spreading jokes in 2020, when I haven't seen anyone on the left ever unironically mention man-spreading as a problem since I've been a part of leftist spaces, and haven't even seen radfems mention it in 3 or 4 years now. And the same goes for the right still using the same pictures of triggered feminists from 2011 and 2012 as representatives of the left, even though the discourse has moved hugely since then. The Stormfronters knew that this was a community they could have free reign over, who were already upset and far removed from society, and in some cases reality itself, who literally had nowhere else to go because they didn't feel they fit anywhere else. And I think some people could more easily picture death before they could see themselves part of a community more wholesome than 4chan. Because once you get to a certain point in your life, you can become so jaded that you are unable to appreciate the good in anything. Your life has become so devoid of goodness that good things seem inauthentic, and people being nice and kind and respectful to each other seems fake. But if you want to be super edgy for the rest of your life and lose yourself to the depths of pessimistic nihilism, that's your prerogative, I guess. But in modern day, there are
plenty of internet communities out there that can offer far more than 4chan. It all depends on whether you're willing to make the effort to leave just a few things behind you. Now the next section is a final summary, so I might be repeating some stuff, and if you're only concerned with the stuff that's majority related to 4chan, feel free to skip, but it provides some context around my own experience and how much it aligned with the general 4chan experience described herein.
Oh, Madrid, it's nice to see you. It's really nice to be here. I love your warmth. Still beer, fat fuck, smoked out cowboat, sequin, mountain ladies. I love your warmth. Put your arms around me, piddly digits, itchy britches. I love you all.
I'm sorry if that transition was a little strange. I just wanted to kind of have a bit of a change of pace to bring things back to this like final little bit that I want to do in person, because this is like a quick summary of my steps processing this, and this is completely off the book. This is like, it is what it is. So for me, obviously, you know, I've been drawing quite heavily on my personal experiences in this video, as you can probably tell. I just wanted to sort of maybe clarify and summarize a little bit with regards to my personal experience. I didn't think about this particular thing until this year, or like it was something that I guess was in my awareness but had never really been dealt with, which is that up until the age of 17 I didn't have a single person in my life that I could trust to talk to about anything that I had going on. You know, any personal issues, any problems at home. I had like literally not a single person I felt I could trust, because I'd been driven away from almost everyone, to the point where, you know, even the people who I thought of as my closest friends, our relationships had never evolved past, you know, casual conversation, talking about media, banter, jokes and insults. Like, I never had the opportunity to connect with people on a personal level. And I think even after hitting 17, there were, you know, a handful of people who I was close to for a short period of time. There were some relationships that spanned years, but people who I didn't get to see very often. And that's a common theme amongst my friendships, is I have these very close friends that I love spending time with, and they're scattered all around either my country or other countries. And so I only get to see them once or twice a year at most. And I think because of growing up in a period of time where everyone was connecting online and asking for someone's phone number seemed archaic, I never really developed a liking for phone calls or video chats so much. There are very few people who I would go out of my way to call on the phone, most of whom are members of my family. Not having that practice of speaking to people, of actually knowing that I could reach out to someone. I think throughout the entire of high school I must have only had 2 or 3 friends' phone numbers. And that was I would never ring for a casual conversation. I would either ring to find out if I could meet them in person, or I wouldn't ring them at all. And this is all a long time ago now, and it's stuff that I've mostly processed, but the realization that I came to this year of the fact that I went 17 years of my life without having a single person I could confide in consistently, without having a single person to give me guidance, to tell me what to do with my life, because I was, academically talented. My parents basically left all of my decisions up to me. They didn't, they thought I was smarter than them, so they didn't have any idea how to guide me. No one at school gave me any real guidance. They just thought I would do well. I didn't talk to anyone about any real decisions that I made. I had to live my entire life pretty much alone, and feeling always, even amongst the people that I called my friends, that I was an observer in a conversation that was happening without me, rather than someone who could join in and be a part of the fun. Because I constantly found myself being talked over, being pushed out of conversations, being laughed at, being ridiculed, being driven from one group of people to another, because eventually I just didn't want to be around those people anymore. And for me, I was lucky because I got to 18, I had started to begin to shed this feeling that I was helpless, and really all it took was one genuine intimate connection with another human being, and for them to say, you're gonna do great, people are gonna love you, you just need to get out of this town. For someone to reassure me of that, and for me to have the ability to carry through with that and go away and become nobody, saved me. Because being nobody was better than being the Alexander Earl Thornton that everyone in my hometown knew. Because I came with a reputation that was perpetuated by the people I chose to spend my time with, because I had nothing else. And it's funny that the first thing that gave me a little bit of confidence was the fact that when we all moved off from high school to college at 16, the people in my class laughed at all my jokes. The people in my class wanted to talk to me. The people in my class generally got on with me and I got on with them. I appreciated their help, they appreciated mine. But then at lunchtime I went and I sat down at the dinner table around the people that I'd known for years and grown up with, knowing that half a dozen people at that table thought I was worthless, thought I was subhuman, would never engage me in conversation unless it was to put me down in some way. And this isn't about feeling sorry for me. I don't want to make this about me, and to be honest, I expected to get through this a little bit faster, but this is about the rest of the kids, because they deserve better, and I might not be able to do much to make it better for them, but I can do this. And I'm not here to lay blame. Kids don't know what they're doing, and they don't know what they're saying, and they don't know how different people's lives are, they don't know how different people think, they don't know what's going on in anyone's head but their own, and they have no conception of it past a certain boundary that's pretty difficult to overcome when you're as self-centered as a teenager. So I don't want to put any blame on the people, because it's a system and it breaks us all, and there's ways in which that we all suffer through it. And also, I was an asshole a lot of times to a lot of people, largely as a defense mechanism, because it was the only thing I fucking had. But I was, and I accept that, and I'm sorry for anyone who was legitimately hurt by anything I said or did when I was a teenager. But it doesn't matter to me, not anymore. It used to, and it still affects me, but I don't, other than like one person, I don't hold any grudges to anyone from my childhood. It's kind of useless at this point. The damage is done in all directions, and really it's time to move on and try and make it better. And I mostly wanted to do this because it's getting to the point now where eventually people are gonna start seeing this who I know in real life. And I don't want anyone to feel any guilt, and I don't want anyone to think that my experience was something I couldn't deal with and couldn't handle, because I did in my own way. As much as it nearly broke me, I did. Yeah, the system to blame. The way people are raised, the way people are educated, the resources, how people are assessed, whether people get the help and support they need. And that's the thing, is I never needed support for my schoolwork, so no one ever saw a problem, and that's kind of sad. Yeah. Just for a quick sense of scale of the time it takes for something to happen in my life, and for me to tell people when I was like that age. When I was 16, I kicked my dad out. Like straight up, just told him to leave after a bunch of stuff I won't really go into because it's in the past, and you know, we're good friends now, sort of. But yeah, this was before Christmas, I straight up told him to leave. I didn't tell anyone until March. It took me like 3.5 months to tell people that my parents had separated and that I was the one who'd done it. That seems like something someone should be able to tell a friend when it happens. And I just want the kids who come after to have a friend to tell when it happens. I think that's it. My posture's shit. See you, Space Cowboy.